When we consider what trade policy, and let's keep it narrow specifically to China, would look like under a second Biden administration versus a second Trump administration, how big is the difference really?
Yeah, well, good to be with you, Kailey. So in some ways there are some similarities. I think that both President Biden and former President Trump lean a little bit protectionistic. I do think that they have different approaches, though, to economic tariffs. Of course, President Biden has kept on those 25% tariffs on about $350 billion of goods that Trump had put on back in 2018. So he's just kept those on. And then he's also used both tariffs but also export controls and other sort of tools of economic statecraft, if you will, in order to advance national security goals. So I think we would expect more of the same under a Biden administration, maybe a ratcheting up on the edges of in terms of tensions with China, but not necessarily a strategic use of tariffs, which is really where Trump comes in. And that he has a different approach, where he believes in tariffs. He will point to the fact that the goods trade deficit with China has declined about $140 billion since we started putting those tariffs on. And as he has said, and I think that investors are wrong to doubt him, that he will put on a 60% tariff on China. Now, does he put a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports coming into the United States? We'll see. But I do think that folks sort of dismiss his views on trade at their own peril. He believes in tariffs. He's been talking about tariffs since the 1980s. This is a long-held view. And again, I think folks should not doubt that the tariffs will be going up, probably under either administration.
Fascinating. We spoke just last week, Libby, with Virginia's Governor Glenn Youngkin had this to say on Bloomberg about the issue of tariffs. Let's listen to what he said. We'll have you respond.
Of course, the issue of tariffs is something that was used effectively back in the Trump administration in establishing a real recognition that China was competing unfairly. China continues to compete unfairly, and it needs to be combated. And that's why the deep relationship with trusted allies is so important.
It's pretty remarkable, Libby. You talk about what investors actually believe or not believe, specifically from Donald Trump. The fact of the matter is tariffs would have been a curse word in Republican politics before Donald Trump, right? Is this now part of the Republican platform?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joe. I do think that in many ways, this is the party of Trump. He has changed the ideology, particularly around trade. But of course, that's also dovetailed with the fact that President Xi in China has employed some of these economic practices, whether it's IP theft or what have you. So I think that it's been kind of a collision of these two things: Trump ascending to being the leader of the Republican Party, plus a more, arguably restrictive of China in terms of economic practices. So yes, I think that to Glenn Youngkin's point, though, Trump has a different view here, right? He views that tariffs are important, but he also includes our allies in that equation. And I think this is the other thing that folks might be dismissing, is this idea of a baseline tariff. President Trump is campaigning on this idea of a 10% kind of across-the-board tariff on both our kind of enemies and our allies. And I do think that has implications, particularly if he's going to tariff places like Mexico, which, of course, the U.S. is highly reliant on in terms of supply chains, and obviously has implications for inflation as well.
Well, Libby, as we consider what potential policy could look like, again, under a Trump administration or another Biden term for that matter, none of that is really until January, although I guess we might be able to start pricing some things in until November. What about between now and then? Congress has done basically all the big bills it needs to do. Government's funded, at least for the time being. The supplemental passed. Is that all we're going to get?
Yeah, I don't think we are going to get much more from Congress. Of course, we saw the headlines around the motion to vacate, the unsuccessful motion to vacate of Speaker Johnson yesterday. But outside of that, Kailey, in terms of our discussions with clients, no one's talking about at Congress. No one's asking about what they may or may not do, because there are very few critical things right now that Congress needs to do. Of course, they'll need to pass another funding bill at the end of September. We expect that probably will be in the form of a continuing resolution past the election, but that remains to be seen. But outside of that, just no real big inflection point from a market's perspective. Again, all of our clients are just asking about the horse race, the down ballot races, and then sort of moving into kind of what the possible economic implications are.
So gridlock is good. Is back on Wall Street, at least, I guess, for the summer, maybe the fall, Libby. And to your point, the markets are looking toward the election now. Everyone goes underground on Capitol Hill, certainly, to campaign for the summer. The presidential campaign is well underway at this point. Goldman Sachs was out with an interesting warning today, specifically David Kostin, the chief U.S. equity strategist, about what might happen with indecision on election night, that we may not know the next day or days after, with recounts possible, legal action possible. To what extent do you worry about a market risk in November?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that is a risk, and clearly, we saw some of that play out in 2020, and I do think that that certainly could happen. 2024 will be a little bit different, just because, of course, in 2020 everyone was voting in the midst of COVID, and that meant that many more people were voting via absentee ballot than probably they will this election cycle, and that did lead to some questions about election legitimacy and what have you. So clearly it is clearly a risk. What we're guiding clients, so Joe, is this is going to be a close race. I mean, we would say that the White House is basically a toss-up at this point. Polling it's too early, though, on the national level in particular. This will likely come down to the same 6 states that determined the 2020 election. And so if those states are close, then sure, that we may not know the election result come November 6th. So we'll just have to wait and see. I think that the bigger risk is just in terms of a policy perspective, the risk that whomever ascends the White House, A, doesn't have a very strong mandate, but B, half the population doesn't believe that that person is the legitimate president. So I think that could undermine the policy ability, making ability, but then also just sort of the credibility of the office of the presidency.
Finally, Libby, I'm not sure if you've seen, but there was some reporting out of the Washington Post today about a meeting that Donald Trump apparently had with a bunch of oil executives at Mar-a-Lago, telling them that if they collectively contributed $1 billion to his campaign, that he would basically overturn all of President Biden's environmental mandates, other regulations that the energy sector feels like are getting in the way. I'm not sure if you have a thought on what the actual ethics of that exchange would be, but also isn't Donald Trump likely to do a lot of that anyway, regardless of whether or not the energy companies provide $1 billion for his campaign?
Yes. I mean, look, this is not necessarily surprising. I think exactly to your point, this is expected. And in some ways, even though maybe despite the policy environment, of course, traditional oil and is in terms of production is at its all-time highs here in the United States. The same thing can be said for LNG. But the policy environment hasn't been particularly favorable for those sectors under a Biden administration. And clearly they're trying to ratchet up regulations in this sort of 11th hour of the administration. But so we are expecting that sort of day one, President Trump will likely unravel a lot of those executive orders that Biden has put into place in terms of drilling on federal lands, in terms of the LNG export pause. So to your point, no real news here. I'm sure that those CEOs probably weren't that surprised that he was saying that. I think they'd be surprised if he intended to do something different. But again, he's using it as an opportunity to fundraise, not surprisingly.